Great. Thanks a lot for coming. I guess, yeah, I'll try to sort of briefly about myself, my background, and industrious. And then I tried to jot down some like very practical advice on kind of like the major components of what makes a company tick in my sort of experience, and some elements that I think can kind of help make those go more smoothly in the early days of a company. And then obviously, if anyone has any questions. So to start with me, I'm actually like one of those people that had a million careers. I was like a journalist, I was doing a PhD in anthropology, I was a corporate lawyer, I was at a hedge fund. But at the same time, I always had sort of like the 25 business ideas in the back of my mind. I actually had like a list on paper that I was constantly updating. And it just like, I think there was a long time in my life when it felt sort of like frivolous or something to leave something like law or whatever to launch a company. And that actually, like, as a digression, would be my first piece of advice, is that I think before I sort of really became an entrepreneur, I had this of like people getting like doing their seed round and like spending it all on champagne or like a yacht or something, like like a weekend yacht cruise, and that to me was like seemed rather distasteful. But what I found actually is that it's exactly the opposite, and that almost every entrepreneur I know is too heads down, is too quick when something goes really well in their business, when there's something to celebrate, to be like, okay, great, got it, on to the next thing. And so I guess the first piece of advice I would have is that I had a period in my life where I thought that, you know, most people running startups were being perhaps a little frivolous, a little sort of, you know, were probably like celebrating every minor thing at the expense of being serious about their business. And the actual sort of takeaway for me is that we would all do better to stop and smell the roses sometimes. I'm like getting very into this concept lately because there's actually a lot of research around savoring and how when times are going well, if you stop to smell the roses, if you savor those good times, then you have sort of greater reserves to deal with the inevitable sort of negative times that come in the sort of course of any business. But anyway, I was sort of proceeding through that more conventional career, and then the moment where I said, it's time to really sort of move on and try to launch something that I think would be more meaningful for me personally, and that would sort of effectuate something or create something in the real world that would not have existed but for that work, which is such an exciting element of being an entrepreneur, was that I was at this hedge fund, and the head of the fund came in one day during the tsunami in Japan and said, I hope that this bleeping nuclear reactor blows up so that the prices come down more in the Japanese stock market. And I said, like, you know, I have a lot of anxiety about whether this is the right career I should be in. Let's not joke about 100,000 people dying in a nuclear meltdown. And he said, he's like, not only am I not joking, but I will buy us all the nicest bottle of champagne you've ever seen and throw the biggest party you've ever been to if the reactor blows. And that evening, I started calling around to some friends and saying, it's time, you know, does anyone want to sort of workshop ideas with me, et cetera. So the first sort of endeavor I ended up launching has a nonprofit arm and a for-profit arm. It was called Kepler. And it's essentially a hybrid offline-online university. And like in the classic, every startup has some like crazy pivot moment. The original idea was to bring pure online classes to East Africa. And as probably most of you know, like online universities have horrifying graduation rates. Like University of Phoenix. Would anyone want to guess what University of Phoenix's graduation rate, like the largest online university in the US, is? 5%. Yes, basically 5%. Okay, I would have thought like 25 before I got into that world. And so we pivoted and essentially created a half offline structure where it's a flipped classroom. So instead of doing your homework at home and your lecture in class, you watch your lecture at night and you go in during the day in class and do your homework with your colleagues. And that way we're able to provide it at a really sort of reasonable price in that market. And then it immediately, and this, I mean, this, a lot of us probably, or you'll have this experience. There's like some little twist, and then you see traction like go through the roof. And so that started growing very quickly. It's, Kepler's now about to launch the first university inside of a refugee camp. They're expanding to 2 more countries. The company I currently run, I actually launched on the side as a side project with a friend, where the same sort of takeaway, and I should note that I feel like I'm like R. Kelly at an Usher concert right now or something, because we are like WeWork is our sort of main competitor. Though I love WeWork actually, and I'll get to the fact that you'll see, ignore competitors or learn from them and love them, but certainly don't fear them. But anyway, that same sort of seeing in an academic context in a very measurable way how bringing people together in the physical world, even in contexts where people are getting more and more used to doing things virtually, doing things in a distributed way, that bringing people into the same room immediately created such enormous advances in learning, in creativity, in people's capacity, that I got very interested in what that would look like in a work context. And as companies continue to distribute their teams and experiment with either virtual work or sort of allowing someone who wants to work in Minneapolis, even if your company is based in Atlanta, how to do that in a way that would be humane and happy and keep people engaged at work. So a business partner and I launched Industrious. Our first location was in Chicago. And I'll take 30 more seconds just to describe what Industrious is before getting to this, which is the sort of premise behind Industrious is that sort of the fundament of this kind of business, of a sort of, co-working, et cetera, is essentially that, you can drive great experiences through higher utilization. So if you think about this room, if this room were used 2% of the time, or let's say 5% of the time versus 50% of the time, if this room is used 50% of the time, you can spend 10 times as much on it for the same average cost per use as if this room were used 5% of the time. And our thesis was that element was going to be attractive to much more than just startups, entrepreneurs, freelancers, et cetera. That same dynamic would be just as meaningful to Allstate or any sort of company that was trying to provide great experiences in their regional offices, but might not have the scale in their regional offices to actually provide over-the-top wonderful workplace experiences. And the other half is that we're in a moment now where all of us care more and more and more every day, at least statistically, not everyone in this room necessarily, but if you represent like the US population, every year people care more about workplace engagement, happiness at work, workplace environment, and less about salary as the main sort of driving force behind decisions about where to work. And so in the old days, maybe it was okay for Pfizer to have a kind of shitty Columbus regional office. And then one day they woke up and that was the main sort of thing that the people they were trying to recruit for were looking for. And so that was why we launched Industrious, was to say, how can we create really engaging, dynamic, beautiful shared spaces that would be appealing not just to entrepreneurs like us, but to law firms or to the whole gamut of types of industries. It was like it's been a big success since day one, which is like we've certainly had our hiccups, but we're now in 11 cities. We'll be in 25 by the end of this year, and probably I would say our specialty, relative to somewhere like a WeWork, is you walk in Industrious, it's a little bit more. It feels like more quiet, elegant. Like it has a slightly different vibe, but it's not a very this is a somewhat similar product. And then our specialty is like Lyft, Pinterest, Airbnb, TD Bank, whoever, doing multi-market sort of arrangements with us, where hopefully soon will be all of their regional markets outside of their headquarters. I'm happy to answer a couple questions about the business itself, just because I'm sure I'll refer to it when describing this, if anyone has any.
Hi, I'm a little bit interested in your first startup, Kepler.
Yeah.
I'm also very interested in your second startup, of course, but I just have one question about the first, about Kepler. So you said that you have a little twist, so that you make your startup from very flat to take off. And I guess that initially, before you have that takeoff, it must be very hard for you because you are building this kind of like a marketplace. You have to find people to. It's a peer-to-peer. You say it's a peer-to-peer flip-flop. So you must be finding it very hard to find students to take classes on this platform. What twist you made so that more people were getting to this side?
So. Yeah, so the twist was or the sort of pivot was to make it a more expensive product that had a more robust in-person component, and to bring more sort of serious teaching experts on the ground. So essentially to sort of make it a less discontinuous or less extreme difference from what people were used to on the ground. And it was very difficult at first when we were trying to provide more sort of, or going down the path of what sort of pure online would look like. But I think, and I'll get to this, but I think like one of the major advantages we had is that we were not trying to create a product for which there wasn't an existing market and convince people they needed it. 1% of the country goes to college, and so and everyone would like to. And in fact, because of the difference in cost for university and what people's capacity is, you'll have the valedictorian of a high school who's not actually able to go to college. And so, I mean, from a business, nonprofit, and just from a product point of view, that's an amazing place to be in, where you're basically saying you have a customer that wants something like your product desperately, and it's simply figuring out what are the right obstacles to remove from their path to enable them to consume that product. That's the position you always want to be in as as like any sort of B2C provider.
Thank you.
Anything else? All right, I will jump in then to. So this is not a real thing in the sense that like I didn't go to business school. This is not like Porter's 5, whatever. This is just how I tend to think. I said I used to work at a hedge fund, and I think when we would try to break down like in my mind like what makes business tick, this is kind of how I tend to think about like the components of a business. You basically start with you have a product, you have to sell that product to customers. That produces essentially like what your unit economics are. So, essentially how much, if you layer on how much it costs you to produce that product. Those three form your unit. And then you have a sort of growth plan, strategic plan, however you want to think of that. That's basically how do you use that unit and what are you going to do with that unit? And then are the two resources that you need to execute on that strategic plan. There are others, but the two main ones by far are the people that populate your company and the sort of larger constituents that help make your company tick, and then the funds to execute it. And I think particularly in an early stage company, it's hard not to spend all your time thinking about that. So I'll get to that last. So these are just a couple random sort of like lessons for each of these that I think I've sort of taken away from Kepler and now Industrious. The first is on the product side. You think about like kind of the way people approach public perception of their product. My belief is that like entrepreneurs almost invent of two axes. There's like awareness and perception. Entrepreneurs seem to always sort of index or over-focus on awareness and not enough on perception, which is to say on how many people know what my product is, not how do the people who know what my product is feel about that product. And like in my head, I think like it's kind of easy to think of it as, like there's a Thanksgiving dinner and most entrepreneurs are picturing like, I want to go to Thanksgiving dinner next November and have my aunt know what my company does and like ask me questions about my company. when like really it's not, you shouldn't be focused on like that moment, which people do dream about, that like you meet someone for the first time. Hopefully you're not meeting your aunt for the first time, but you know, and they know all about Industrious. But that really doesn't matter that much. Much more important, particularly in the early stages, is the Thanksgiving dinner that you're not at, where your customer is telling their whole family about your product and how much they love your product. And so I would like always be testing yourself, like, am I really sort of taking the right equilibrium and thinking about the value of sort of perception versus breadth of awareness for my product. And the second, and this is like, I think everyone kind of knows this, so I will run through this one, is just that it is much easier, as I said in the case of like university education, it is much, much easier to be removing obstacles to a market that already exists, a product that people already want, or you know, to be tweaking a product that people already consume to make it a better experience, a happier experience, a more seamless experience than it is to convince people, you know, that they sort of should want something that they don't already want. And it doesn't mean there haven't been companies that have successfully done that. That's just a lot harder. And so if you're still in the sort of product definition phase, you know, it is much easier to sort of to meet existing demand in a more seamless, better way than to sort of drum up or sort of stimulate new demand. So then on the customer side, the two things I would say is, one, if you're trying to think about like what kind of customers does my product serve, there's a big difference, I think, in the likelihood of success of companies that are able to upsell to existing customers rather than non-recurring products that have to continually generate new customers over and over and over and over again. And so this is why I really like B2B businesses, but like in general, I think it's just like if you start to see traction, you'll have a cadre of core customers, and if you have the type of product where those core customers can continue to grow with you as a business, that makes life 100 times easier. And then the second thing I would say is that you want to see traction with customers as early as possible. And people say this all the time, that it's like, you're not a real business until someone has paid, you know, cold, hard cash for your product. And that can be really hard. And I think there are ways to simulate traction in the early days that are not quite the same thing as a paying customer, but that can really, really help your business. You know, for us, for example, if we were entering the Chicago market, let's say I'd had a lot of trouble raising money for it, we could have taken out, you know, we could have taken out like done a ton of Craigslist ads for a non-existent location, and gotten 600 people to apply to be at Industrious, and then gone to investors with this sort of, now that's like a little skeezy. I don't think we would have necessarily done that. But I think in general, like I would think about in advance of your early paying customers, what are ways to model like the moment where someone would pay? Because I think that's much more convincing than what I see in these early kind of investor decks, where it's like, here's the market size and here's how we're going to, like a little even goofy experiment can mean a lot more than a sort of prospective, here's what I think the potential market is and here's why I believe people will want this product. Then on the unit economic side, the first thing I would say is just, this is everything. You have to get this right as soon as possible. There's no way to grow out of bad unit economics in the vast majority of cases. And I think a lot of times people sort of worry about getting their overhead just right, or move on to a lot of other things before really, really understanding to the greatest degree possible at the individual product or unit level, what are the sort of, you know, in the most basic way, like what are the revenue and costs associated with that? And the other thing is, it's really easy to focus on essentially two things for unit economics, depending on the type of business, like, you know, an ROI and your margins. And those are obviously the two most important things, but there are other metrics that are very helpful to focus on. And if you do really well on them, will help you with fundraising. And the one I love is basically the ratio of the lifetime value of an individual customer to the acquisition cost for that customer. And there are very successful businesses where it's like 1.1 or 1.2, but the higher you can get that, that's like and this, I'm not the first, I mean, this is like a pretty standard metric, but I think it's an underutilized one, and one that's definitely worth thinking about very early in the life of a business. And maybe one of the 2 or 3 metrics that are worth, depending on your business, having core goals around. The next thing I would say, actually, on the sort of topic of core goals, is when you move, now you've got your unit, you move to like strategic planning for the business, is I think the majority of startups I see wait too long to do real strategic planning. Everything's moving a mile a minute. You're just trying to sort of, get everything together. And a lot of times, it's a year and a half into the business, particularly because if you think about the pyramid of sort of strategic planning, where it's like values, vision, mission, values, like however you want to think, like strategy, tactics. It might be like you need to be in business a while to really know what your mission and vision is. And so you can hold off on the middle of that pyramid. But I think like very early in the life of the business, you should have 3 to 5 concrete 2-year goals, 3 to 5 concrete 1-year goals, and then for each team in your business, 3 to 5 kind of objectives and key results for every quarter. And it doesn't work if there's 11 or 12 of them, because the second you have to go back to a Google Doc to like reference what they are, then they can't happen in conversation and they can't drive decision making. And so that's why I would say you want to stick to 3 to 5 for each of those. But you have to have them. And in a very early life of business, it can be super hard. Like it can feel like you're picking things at random, but sometimes that's okay. And that's the next thing I would say, which is that sometimes you have to pick things at random, but particularly like people who went to Columbia, kind of brainy people in general, tend to like often I think be weak decision makers, and I myself am like, I think I'm a relatively weak decision maker because I'm overly analytical. I'm like used to getting an A and doing things right, and so it can be very hard to make a decision where you don't feel you have complete information. But this is, I'm sure you've heard this before, but it is so true that it's better to make a decision than the right decision 95% of the time. And one thing you can do to help yourself is to basically say, what are the 5 or 6 decisions this quarter where that's not true? And I'm going to put real time and real analysis into those decisions, and maybe the team is going to gather all the data necessary to make that decision right. And having identified those, everything else, I'm going to apply the rule that it's better to make a decision than to sort of have the perfect one. And there's a million reasons why that's true, but first and foremost, you won't start generating actual real life data on the consequences of that decision until the decision has been made and has started to be executed upon. And then once you have that data, it's invariably easier to pivot if you need to than people imagine it will be. The final 2 on strategic planning is that companies also wait way too long to put systems in place. So I think lots of startups will be a year and a half in, will be doing $10 million of revenue or $5 million of revenue, have a ton of customers, and they're still working out of an Excel doc for their sales, for example, because it's expensive and a pain in the ass to move to a CRM. But the amount of information you've lost because you waited that long to do that is really, really, really damaging. And what happens is you're going to find yourself a year and a half in going to investors and having to tell a story about, we've learned so much from our growth. We've learned so much from all the customers we have, and we can apply that data in a really robust way. And you're going to know that actually it's all in an Excel sheet. We didn't tag enough actual pieces of information, and so we're not able to generate the customer insights that we would have liked to. And so I think like it's a pain, but start to sort of roll out systems, particularly like data gathering systems for non-digital products, earlier than one would anticipate doing it. And then the final one on this, to go back to the WeWork point I was making, is there's like that quote about how you know, every startup worries way too much about competitors when like 99% of startups die because of their own mistakes, so they die because of sort of suicide rather than murder. And certainly, at least in my observation, that's absolutely true. And if you build a great product that your customers love and you learn from what your customers want and continue to refine it, that's going to drive the growth of your business much more than minor points of sort of comparison or differentiation from the next competitor over. And then sort of finally to focus on the resources that you need to sort of drive this. On the people side, the first thing I would say is there's sort of that like saying that every time a company triples in size, everything falls apart and you have to reinvent it, which is 100% true. And I think if you can hire in waves and sort of tie your hiring to those moments, it will make your life 100 times easier, because it's a lot of effort to onboard new employees. And oftentimes there's a dip in productivity for the first couple months, like versus you doing it yourself or your co-founder doing it yourself. And so the more that can happen in waves rather than sort of via trickle, the better the company is able to absorb the effort and sort of dislocation involved in that. The second is to scorecard for hiring. I think the book this comes from is called Who, but I think that's very, very important, particularly for startups, because what happens with startups is people are always networking you with people, often end up hiring people in the early days who are people you know or who you met. And so you're less likely to have started with an objective sort of scorecard for here's what the elements of the role are, here's what success would look like in the role, and here's the type of people that I think, or the type of qualities we're looking for that will drive success in that. And even if you throw the scorecard out the window because this person is such hot shit or they really impressed you, you'll at least know the way in which that person diverges from what the sort of core objective criteria that you're looking for out of the role is. The next thing I would say is I think networking in general is overrated. I've made hires I really am happy with from networking, but I think we just did a run through of all our sort of 2015 hiring, and one of the big takeaways was that where we had a scorecard and we went out and aggressively tried to poach our top 5 people that we had identified on LinkedIn, even though if they were people we didn't know in advance, or networked into a particular person, those were the hires that have we sort of seen the best return on. So it's not that you shouldn't be networking, it's not that you shouldn't, but I think the sort of idea that like all your best hiring is going to come from networking is not necessarily true. I really think poaching depends somewhat on industry, but poaching is underused. And some people feel it's like they feel it's untoward or that they feel embarrassed about doing it, but you should not feel embarrassed about doing it. This person's not going to take the job unless you sold them on the vision of your company and convince them that they're going to be better off in life and happier with you than where they currently are. And so you've done them a favor if you poach them. And the last point is to get compensation right ultra early in the life cycle of a business. I've messed this up very seriously twice in my rather short time as an entrepreneur. One had to do with taxes for expatriates at Kepler, and then at Industrious, we promised equity in a form that we couldn't actually deliver once we got into the taxes, and people get furious about it and saying, oh, we were a startup, we didn't know what we were doing, or everything is not an excuse. And so I would make sure that you're really airtight, that you really understand, and just think about it's easy to be like, oh, we'll deal with that later, or I'll give someone an offer letter that's a little ambiguous. Don't. And then to finish on fundraising, it's very hard. I realize it occupies the majority of most sort of CEOs' time, and that's fine. And it helps you. The more you're telling the story of your business, it helps you to refine what your business is about. But the 3 things I would say is, one, this is you should steal this from the nonprofit world. Nonprofit fundraisers all the time will say whoever, Daniel Auk or someone you have a lot of expertise in this, and I saw that you went to business school. Can you give me some advice on whatever? and then like you start to develop a relationship and then you hit them up. And that's just as true in the for-profit world. I think I've always had a lot of success starting a relationship via asking for, sorry, yeah. So, you know, I think that is like, it is very effective. People can see through it and it doesn't matter. Like they will still be sort of animated by that type of interaction, even if they know 100% what's coming down the line. And then the last two, one is that, you know, you want to sort of structure your funding rounds around a set of obstacles where you basically say to your investors, our company is worth X today. If we can prove that, depending on what round you're in, if we can prove that we can replicate in 3 markets, that we can withstand direct competition from someone down the street, and that we can hire this kind of leadership team, like these are the 3 obstacles we've set out. And once we've knocked those out and proven success in those, now our valuation is, you know, will be 12 million instead of 6 million, or 80 million instead of 40 million. And the more you can cluster the timing of those, the better, so that you can walk and start a round where you've said, you know, look at these 5 questions I've answered in the last 2 months, rather than being like, okay, well, we're halfway through answering this one, and we answered that one 2 months ago. That makes it a lot harder to get big valuation jumps between rounds. And then this one almost goes without saying, but I've always been shocked. In nonprofit fundraising, we're now doing our 5th fundraising round at Industrious in 2 years, and it never failed to amaze. And other than the fact that if I were an investor, I would not want to put a dollar out until the last possible moment. Like, my nightmare would be to be a middle investor in a round and then the CEO gets hit by a car the next day. And so there has to be real urgency. That was gruesome, I'm sorry. But there has to be real urgency, and you have to find ways, even if they sometimes feel a little bit like, not scammy, but a little bit like they require a little bit of manipulation, you have to find ways to create urgency. You know, if people want, I can elaborate on a few of them, but you have to find ways so that an investor feels like, okay, it's game time. I don't get to like spin my wheels forever, because they will spin their wheels forever otherwise. That's all I have. I'm happy to answer any questions.
So WeWorks, I've had a chance to speak to a couple of their investors in the past, just over lunch and stuff, and I think a couple of them had reservations on the business model, but they ended up investing anyway because of, you know, other pressures and their friends were getting in on the deal. One of the questions that they've had for WeWorks is, okay, so what is, you know, what's going to sustain you during the downturn, and how are you going to ride it out and be a long-term sustainable venture? And the answer that they've received in the past is that, well, there's a certain community that they build here, and everyone wants to be a part of that community. And, you know, analysts are vary in terms of their understanding of what that actually means. If you were asked the same question, and I'm sure your investors probably asked you similar questions, how would you respond to that? Like, how is Industrious going to be, you know, viable for the long run in the real estate sector?
Okay, so just quickly on the previous one about law firms, one final point on that front is that I think spaces like this, one thing that they don't think enough about is that, particularly for client-facing businesses, if you can have a client, like, if you can have a company have a client come to the space and they win that client's business because the client was so wowed by the space, like, you have a customer for life. And I think with like law firms or consulting firms that are often trying to pitch new business, that's where I think a lot of the early sales opportunity is to be like, someone's going to walk into Denton's Labs and you're going to generate $1 million in new revenue because of it. So on the downturn question, I think there's 2 types of investors. There's one type of investor that ultimately says, if you have a product that your customers love and that they're tripping over themselves to have, and if you can show me that, like, you know, for us, Pinterest started at as a $1,000 a month customer, and I can't even tell you the number that they are now, but it's, you know, like, it's a very exciting multiple on that existing number for, you know, for an investor, and that's true for a lot of companies for us. I think ultimately a lot of investors feel like, okay, that dynamic is going to survive any underlying sort of fear in recessions. And I think that tends to be true. Like strong brands that have loyal customers, there are businesses that are more up and down in a recession. But I think like there's sort of that kind of investor. That's probably not the kind of investor I would be. I think there's the investor that is like, list off for me every single thing you're doing to mitigate risk in the case of a recession, because WeWork is out there saying that we crushed in the last recession and co-working grew in the last recession, but I am scared stiff of anyone who tells me they're going to do really well in a recession. So what I want to hear is more about how are you going to break even in the next recession and survive it. And so what we have is a list of actually quite long list of, from customer mix to markets to the structure of the contracts to the structure of our underlying leases, to the amount of, I could go on and on and on, that in the aggregate form, I think, an airtight story for, I don't know what demand is going to look like, but we've done everything we can so that if demand plummets, we're still going to be a surviving, thriving business that maybe we'll just have to sort of stay slightly in the black for a couple years. And the last thing I would say is that I was actually at a hedge fund in the last recession, so the companies that were the most exciting is that those are times when weak businesses tend to go under or have a fire sale, and so they're times of like extraordinary opportunity for strong businesses. So if you can have a little cash in the bank, or you can be weathering slightly better than the next guy, you can come out of the recession 3 times the size of what you were before if you're able to acquire contracting sort of nearby competitors, which you shouldn't worry about, but still.
One question regarding your first nonprofit business. Did you have to raise funds for that? And if so, how hard it was, and where did you look for that?
So there was a for-profit and a nonprofit side. It was actually harder to raise funds for the team that was doing the for-profit side. The nonprofit side, to be perfectly honest, it was, we basically, funders said, for the most part, like it was an extreme list of demands. So most funders were saying, we want an American accredited degree at the end of this. It has to be less than $500 a year. We want proof that people like that you'll have a graduation rate over 60%, et cetera. And that was very hard to do in the early days. And I had a meeting with the president of IKEA, and in the middle of the meeting, he said, I don't know how to do a Swedish accent, but he basically was like, will you provide mental health services at Kepler? And I said, actually, probably not. We have to be tight on our price, and this is where most nonprofits lose their way. If we can't do it for $1,000 a student, then we're not going to do it. And there was like a long pause, and he's like, so it's like the IKEA of higher education. And I had no idea what he was talking about, but I was like, oh, yes, it's like the IKEA of higher education. And what he said was, he could tell I had no idea what he meant. What he said was that at IKEA they say, instead of saying we want a 36-inch desk with fluted legs, they say we want the 14-euro desk that can pack flat and ship for 1.2 euros. And then the engineers hand that to the design team. And so in that meeting, they actually gave us, I think, turned out to be like $11 or $12 million, which in the context of African education is like a really serious amount of money to fund the next 4 years of its operations. And so that is not a normal outcome, though. But I think it can be easier and harder. I loved moving to the for-profit world. It's a lot easier. I mean, I think it's a lot easier to raise money for a for-profit, but I think in the end there's more similarity than what you think. Like you're selling someone an improvement in their quality of life, either via via sort of growth in their income, or growth in how they feel in terms of being connected to a project, in terms of feeling like they've done good in the world. And there's probably more of that in for-profit fundraising than people think. People want to be part of something. They want to say to their friends that this business is doing great things, almost often more than they want to say, I had a 32% IRR on this investment I made over a 1.7-year time horizon.
So you target the same type of investors.
Yeah, and the narrative is very similar. The ask is very similar. They're not that different. In fact, the sort of head fundraiser for Lincoln Center, who's like this legend, has a book on nonprofit fundraising, and I would say like that's worth reading even if you're raising money for a for-profit. All right. Thank you.